Welcome and thank you for joining us today for Hear from the Experts, Best Practices for Evolving from SD-WAN to SASE. My name is Raleigh Gould and I'll be moderating today's event. Our featured speakers are Chris Steffen, VP of Research at Enterprise Management Associates, Amit Nayak, Senior Director, Product Marketing at Zscaler, Kevin Shu, VP, Product Marketing at Versa Networks, and Kieran Roche, co-founder and CTO at Coevolve. Chris has over 25 years of experience as a noted information security executive, technical evangelist, and presenter. He holds over a dozen technical certifications, including Certified Information Systems Security Professional, Certified Information Systems Auditor, and the Certificate of Competence in Zero Trust. Amit is an industry expert with more than 25 years of experience in cybersecurity and enterprise network transformation. He is currently the Senior Director of Product Marketing at Zscaler, where he is responsible for the go-to-market strategy for Zscaler Zero Trust branch solutions. Kevin is a VP of Product Marketing at Versa Networks, where he leads positioning and messaging for secure networking and SASE solutions. He brings over 20 years of experience in cybersecurity and enterprise technology, translating complex architectures into clear, compelling narratives for customers and partners. Kieran is a visionary technology and business leader with over 2 decades of international experience in IT, networking, security, and digital transformation strategy. After working in Europe and the US in technical and strategic consulting roles for 15 years, Kieran co-founded Coevolve in 2014 with a vision to redefine global managed network and security services. And now that we've introduced you to all our expert speakers, I wanted to turn things over to today's first featured speaker, Chris Steffen. Chris, take it away.
Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate it. Well, welcome to this webinar. I hope that you enjoy it. I know that I am going to enjoy it. The crew that we have here, we've already practiced this webinar, kind of anecdotally through a gazillion different calls, and we're going to try to keep it under 17 hours long. There is literally that much content that we could talk about. This webinar is part of a report that EMA created, and these wonderful gentlemen helped sponsor. And the data in the report is outstanding. So at the end of the webinar, there'll be a link to the report, call to action from each of these organizations that you can go visit their version of the report, their website, whatever have you. Definitely worth taking a look at. We decided we were going to do this webinar a little bit different. Instead of me taking and reading the report to you, which is going to put you all to sleep, we thought we'd actually have a genuine conversation about what's going on. And this is the crew to do it. So the first question that I really want to talk about is, why is SASE an urgent priority? Talk to me about, in your organizations, talk to me about why you are seeing that SASE is not just this evolution of SD-WAN. It is actually something that is driving transformation and something that people are looking at. Kevin, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of interesting nuggets looking at the data here. In fact, maybe I'll take a non-obvious choice that I'm looking at right here. Clearly we're thinking about key trends like convergence when you think about SASE. I think you're thinking about some of these core elements around AI, whether it's the threats that are being presented to companies and security and networking teams today. Often actually forgotten is one of these middle ones, edge compute and edge cloud. Like when I think of a bucket like that, that is also something where you're starting to see convergence, and SASE plays a clear role. And that convergence is occurring in lots of different places. I think it's why even the definition of edge is changing. And maybe the one example that I'll give, like we're talking about this title with SD-WAN and the word SASE in it. I think the WAN edge is actually a place where you can see edge computing start to converge. And it's because of things like AI converging with security, converging with networking. And you're just seeing more and more things like inference being pushed to edge. And I think places all across the board for SASE will have to carry part of, I don't want to call it burden, but let's call it the burden of where AI is processed, where inference occurs, and where training can even occur.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I'll tell you too. We conducted this research at the very beginning of this year. It wrapped up the very beginning of this year, and I'm here to tell you the AI component, the AI, how AI is viewed, and part of the AI initiatives. We actually just literally yesterday, not, in fact, not even 12 hours ago, wrapped up AI research today, and I am telling you that it's even more prevalent today as a driver. So definitely something to be thinking about. I know it's the top of our list here. It's definitely something to be looking at when it's all said and done. I mean, are you seeing kind of the same thing?
Yeah, Chris, as I look at this data, right? So had we done this, looked at this data 2 years ago, right, we would probably not see AI top of the list. I would have seen
I
more like
doubt it. Yep.
hybrid multi-cloud architecture, zero trust initiatives, kind of bubble up to the top. But AI is a reality today that most organizations have to grapple with. And one thing I'm seeing a lot across the market is this realization that you can go into an AI universe with this boat anchor of legacy infrastructure dragging you down, right? And you have to transform. You have to take that step to enable you for AI to embrace AI within your organization safely, securely, without expanding attack surface, while managing the vulnerabilities, while enabling the productivity gains that it's supposed to deliver. Right.
Yeah. Again, I couldn't agree with you more about that. Kieran, did you have anything that you wanted to add?
No, I think very much aligned with what Amit's saying there. I think we often use the phrase center of gravity, and I think SD-WAN really represented that big shift in where the center of gravity of these enterprise networks actually was, that it wasn't the on-prem data centers anymore. It became a way to design a network that was very cloud-centric and accessing SaaS applications in an efficient way and so on. And I think that laid a lot of the groundwork for what we're seeing now with SASE. Now that enterprises have moved to that way of thinking and that way of operating, it becomes much easier then to layer in additional value-added services and security functionality and so on in that cloud model, as opposed to having everything pulled back to dedicated appliances in that legacy model. So it's very much representing a completely new way of thinking for the network. But then the biggest benefit enterprises can tap into there is that they now have the ability to protect themselves against a lot of these threats at that sort of cloud scale, being able to do it at a much greater level of scale than they could have previously with these legacy architectures. So I think that's very much part of the conversations we're having with our clients as to why they're going down this path.
So, and I agree with everything that everybody said. Let me throw another one out there, and it's particularly relevant to me. We were chatting right before we got on the webinar. When I start looking at zero trust, AI and SASE both have taken and contributed so much to the conversation when it comes to zero trust. Zero trust is not a science project, just like AI. I promise you, AI is not a science project either. I think that you're all aware of this at this point. But zero trust and having a strong zero trust infrastructure actually makes AI maybe even possible to protect from the very get-go. I know it's ranked a little bit further down this list, but it's still very relevant in the grand scheme of things. And you're seeing organizations that every type, maybe their zero trust project actually stalled a little bit, whatever that might be. But with the advent and the velocity that AI is coming at us, I think that those zero trust projects have actually picked back up and are becoming more and more relevant than ever. If you are one of those out there that has a zero trust project and it is stalled, take and look at how AI is going to implement that. There's lots of information out there. Ping me. You can actually ping all three of these guys too. They'll be happy to take and share their perspectives on that too. But it is very, very relevant in the grand scheme of things. Like I
Yeah,
said, we could
Chris,
talk
if I
about all
can
this for about 1,000 hours, right?
Yeah.
So,
Chris, if I may jump in on that point and just real quick, right? So we've always said with zero trust, like if it's reachable, it's breachable. But
yep,
that fact has never been more true than now with what we're seeing with the advent of these newer models that can find vulnerabilities in almost anything. So if there's ever a more urgent need to do zero trust, it's now, right?
yeah.
Make sure you're not exposing anything. Make sure you don't have unnecessary lateral movement. You're segmenting effectively and things can talk to other things only when they're supposed to, right?
Yeah, totally agree. I totally agree. And let me say it to you this way, and I'll wrap up this particular question so we don't spend 6 hours on it. When you start thinking about the velocity of AI, don't worry about the technical capabilities, so on and so forth. Just think about the velocity of innovation that is coming from AI. Not talking about the security. I'm not talking about the productivity. I'm not talking about any of that. I'm just talking about the rapid pace that is being implemented within our environments. If you don't have an architecture using SD-WAN, using zero trust, using whatever you want in that situation to help you secure, there is no way that you will keep up. So again, keep that in mind, and that is, at least from my perspective, and I think you guys' perspective, why it is such a priority today. The next question that I wanted to talk a little bit about, let's talk about how SASE platform is single integrated versus best of breed multi-vendor approach. Is it really something? So you have this whole world that believes that you want the one throat to choke. I'm not really certain that I necessarily believe that, but I'm willing to hear the conversation. And you can see its data kind of split 2/3 one way, 1/3 the other way. Is it really something where it makes sense to have a vendor that is the SASE platform, or do you want a multi-vendor approach when you're taking and looking at these networks? And I know you guys actually all do it all the ways. So kind of give me your perspective. Kevin, Amit, let's start out with you on this one.
Yeah, this is an interesting one, right? So I think the numbers here are reflective and indicative of one reality, right? Everybody has some infrastructure, some network infrastructure that they start with, and it's not always
Is
easy
anybody
to.
here actually talking to anybody with a quote unquote greenfield? I mean, does the greenfield actually exist, right? I mean, people use that as a stupid hypothetical all the time. And if you have a username and password, you're not in a greenfield anymore. So is there really ever that you're taking and in through any of your sales motions, are you actually talking with that customer that is truly a greenfield?
Yeah, I mean, what we see is we see a lot of existing environments. We do
Yeah.
occasionally see greenfield in the context of new builds or new expansion initiatives or new campus, right? Where people are looking at it as like, hey, let me start from a clean slate. Let me think about single vendor SASE from day zero or day one, right? And those conversations do happen. They're not sort of they don't dump. That's not the vast majority of it,
I would
but
imagine.
yeah. But if anyone's starting today, they're thinking about single vendor SASE, right?
Yep.
But the reality is there's always going to be legacy infrastructure for a vast majority of the market, and you have to think about how do you integrate, how do you migrate from that world to the SASE world, and then there's going to be some in between phase, right, where you have a bit of both. You're in the SASE world, you're also in the legacy networking world, and you still have to make security work across all of this.
Kiran, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think we've seen this really evolve over the course of how these technologies have matured. So, if I go back 10 years into the past, we were the entity that was combining the two together. We were taking SD-WAN and then taking an SSE platform, and we were the ones integrating it and being the single point of contact for the enterprise because that was the only way to do it. And we've built up a lot of expertise in doing that. We can see that model working very well for global organizations that want very finely tuned policies and controls and have a real hand in how the traffic gets manipulated across the network. However, we've definitely seen a very rapid rise in the single vendor model. There's platforms in the market now that are able to provide that full functionality. They can provide the networking component and the security component. And generally, the reason we see clients looking at that and seeing the appeal of that is because you have a lot of that end-to-end context. You've got a device plugged into a LAN port on an appliance at a site. You can follow that all the way from the user back to the application that they're accessing, and it's within a single platform's context. So I think, again, to the point we had on the last slide about the threat landscape becoming much more sophisticated and so on, having all of that data in a common platform, there are real advantages to that. But as we've seen, there's a lot out there in terms of multi-vendor solutions that are deployed at scale and will likely be in place for quite a number of years. So we've built up a real level of expertise supporting both because of that we have to be able to cater for the needs of all of those different types of clients.
Yep, that makes all the sense in the world. Kevin, did you have anything to add?
I do. I think maybe one additive thing that, fundamentally, that I don't think people would debate that aspiration of a single vendor SASE is the gold standard, like a fully unified experience across networking and security and all of the subcategories that come with it. What I think we're observing today is, I mean, you talked about just having pre-existing something there. And so that ultimately means that this is going to be a journey. And so the multi-vendor platforms are part of that journey. Now, the additional detail I might add is that it's not just a technology thing. It's also a people thing. It's also a process thing that's integrated into how we think about technology. So while yes, like tomorrow a new budget could pop up and I could certainly, even if I could go out and just replace everything with a single technology stack, your people have to be transitioned over. They have to be enabled differently. How you handle the processes inside either your SOC or your NOC have to adapt as well. So all of that will take time.
Yeah, Kevin, you're touching upon a good point there, right, around sort of the operational side of this. And, historically, we've had silos of networking teams and security teams, and we're seeing the walls kind of dissolve a little bit, but there's still a lot of independent groups and teams within organizations, right? And I think
Exactly.
we have a question addressing that, but yeah, I think that's another aspect of this is like, hey, when you envision single vendor SASE, like you're also implying you're kind of bringing all of this together organizationally, right?
Well, I mean, isn't that the dream, right? I mean, that's what we as the people who talk about this, you guys as the vendors, but even as the enterprise, that's I think is really what the goal when it's all said and done. Even the title here, the enterprise is decisively rejects and ringer lock-in. I don't really think that's true. I think that people really actually want that one single pane of glass to be able to deal things with. But I don't always know how realistic that is. So I think that's aspirational. But again, time will tell, and there are solutions that will help you get there either way. So then, the next question I thought was actually really kind of compelling. I wanted to talk specifically about whether is SASE primarily a security initiative, or is it a network initiative, or is it a UI experience, or what is it when it's all said and done? And what are the drivers, right? Why are you taking and going down this path? And the answer is all of those things. You're trying to achieve all of those things. But Kieran, why don't you start us with your perspective on this? I have an opinion. I really didn't agree with all the data, and I'll be really interested to see what your guys' opinion really is.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to see these priorities rising so high on the list. But I think there's a layer of truth to it that I hear in a lot of conversations with our clients, in that everyone's had that experience over the past few decades of when you go into the office, the network, everything, accessing applications is way slower than your home internet access. And there's long been that expectation that the price you pay for having that additional level of enterprise grade security is everything's much slower, everything's less responsive, and so on. And if you look back to traditional architectures, that was generally because you were backhauling everything to a centralized firewall. Everything was going through a choke point out to the internet at that point. And that became just the default that people would accept for a long time, really. And what we've seen with SASE architectures, where you can take that same level of security, but now effectively dissolve it into the cloud, and it's available everywhere, but it's also available very close to where each of those users are. You can meet or even increase that security posture expectation that the business has, but now you're breaking out to the internet, you're using much higher levels of acceleration for things like TLS inspection and so on, and you're able to deliver an experience that's much closer to what the users would have achieved from a home broadband connection in the past. So I think a lot of enterprises, if we go back, 5-6 years ago and look what happened during COVID, for example, that whole shift to remote working, and that the ZTNA architectures that were quickly adopted then became the new level of expectation for a lot of enterprises, that this is how quickly it can work, this is what we could have. That has forced a rethink of how some of these enterprise networks then are architected. So you're now putting security functionality much closer to all of those users. And if you're a global enterprise, the only way to do that is really through a cloud-based solution with a SASE architecture. So it definitely rings true in terms of some of those conversations we're having with clients.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. It's interesting that you phrased it that way, because once you drive the Corvette sports car, you never want to go back to the Honda Civic, right? And that's really the case across the board. And that isn't just the Corvette or the Honda Civic. It's just that once you have that certain up level and those certain capabilities and those certain expectations, the likelihood of stepping backwards is very, very small. So, Kevin, any thoughts about that?
I do. And actually, Chris, maybe one note. I didn't realize, you disagreed with some of the data, so maybe we should also save a moment. I'd love to hear your perspective on this one as well. But maybe the one thing I'll add to this one, it is telling that the data, these all are above 50%, right? And what it tells us is that people want everything. And it's likely because there's a dependency on some of these on the others. When one doesn't do well, the other actually doesn't do well. And maybe the simple example I'll think about, maybe I'll just take that big blue one at the very top. We know that, of course, you want the productivity gains that come with great performance and user experience. Now, what you generally see as well is when you don't have great performance and user experience, what happens? Sometimes you blame it on the security product, sometimes you blame it on the network. If you blame it on the security product, that might be slowing down your experience. You try and bypass the security controls, and before you know it, you have neither performance nor security. And so I think the most telling thing here is these likely have dependencies on each other. And I think the aspiration to have it all isn't a bad one, because even if you lose one or two of these, you end up starting to lose other buckets unintentionally.
That's right. Yep. No, I totally agree. Emmett, do you have anything to add?
Yeah. So I completely agree with what Karen and Kevin have said about this, right? But the one thing I want to do is I want to zoom out a little bit and just think about like a typical IT organization. We're talking about infrastructure here, right? But if you look at the spend, infrastructure is a tiny fraction of what organizations spend on applications. Right? At the end of the day, what they want to enable, what the average user and and assume non-technical in the company wants to do, they want to open their laptop, log into an application, and they want it to just work. Right? That is the end goal. This is why we do everything we do. And infrastructure's job is to enable that in a smooth and frictionless manner. And security, right? Security has there was a time when security was the blocker, right? Was the point of friction. And we're now moving into a model where security is expected to be invisible, sitting in the background, right, doing its thing without too much user friction. And I think those factors are really important to think about as we think about the SASE transition, right? How do we make security frictionless? And how do we ensure we're optimizing performance by doing things like Karen mentioned, like avoiding backhaul, right? Avoiding unnecessary backhaul, getting traffic to the applications as quickly as possible, and not throwing a lot of hurdles in front of the user.
Yeah, so I'll give you my perspective, and I agree with everything everybody said there. Let me share the idea that when you start taking and looking at the drivers for SASE in general, it is one of the very first pivots that I have found in my experience where it is UX driven. It isn't necessary. You gain some security aspects from it. I'm not trying to say you don't. Let's join reality here. But at the same time, it's one of the very first ones where security and user experience actually coincide on the same plane. And if there is one that has to be picked above the other, I think it is user experience. I don't think it really is both. I think that in this particular case, it's one of those very, very rare wins for security that you actually gain all your security gains, but the rationale, the selling point, the driver behind it was the user experience that you end up gaining. So when it's all said and done, that's where I kind of disagree with the data. I know that you gain all these security aspects. Again, I respect that, and I would argue that again, even after the fact, there's probably more on this list that we didn't even really consider from an AI perspective, from a how is it going to be really integrated in the ZTNA? So how do you DSPM from data security posture management? How do you take and make these things actually all work and play together very nicely? But at the end of the day, I think the number one driver for SASE was the user experience overall, because, as I mentioned before, that expectation of that experience had been set through other previous tools.
Yeah, and Chris, what you said reminds me of one classic security adage, right? If you make security too complicated, users find a way around it.
Yeah, well,
We see this
you're
repeatedly with,
absolutely,
yeah.
yeah, you're absolutely right. And you're seeing, and again, I'm not trying to make this conversation about AI all the time, but you're seeing the same thing with AI, right? It's you basically say, well, we don't want you to take and use AI to do this, that, and the other thing, and so we're going to put some kind of blocker in place that's going to prevent you from using it. Well, we all know how well in the security industry that putting up a blocker actually works, right? So, I mean, that's absolutely nonsensical. So when you have a user experience that is genuinely appreciated to the point where it can actually be the driver for adoption, that is actually unique in the security space. And that's why I really do believe that the SASE adoption came from UX adoption, not through all the security benefits that you get. Not dismissing those, I'm saying that it is wholly unique in that space and we should embrace its uniqueness. So again, like I said, we got to keep on moving on here. Which group, networking or security holder, responsible for the integrated SASE architecture? We kind of knew what the answer to this question was before we ever even asked it, but it is important to take and talk a little bit about it. And more than the question itself, I'm really interested in when you talk to customers and you're in the field. Who are you seeing as the drivers? And more to the point, are there any interesting personas that we aren't talking about that have a role when you start talking about the responsibilities? Yes, security and NetOps can get real. I understand that. But is there anybody else out there that you're starting to see is piping up when it comes to SASE? We just talked about the user experience. Maybe it's somebody in the user experience realm. Maybe it's somebody in HR. Maybe it's somebody, God help us if HR is setting IT priorities. But I mean, when you start taking and talking about it, it is hypothetically possible that you have some other personas out there. So Kevin, why don't we start with you? Who are you seeing out there, and talk to me about this responsibility division a little bit.
Yeah, I think what we're generally seeing within our community, I think this data reflects that well. Like there is just a shared responsibility here. Probably the newest persona or group or budget that's starting to take hold is some of the things we talked about with AI. There's new AI roles that are being introduced into companies. There's new AI budgets that are
Yep.
being introduced into companies. And so ultimately, as you think about introducing either new tools, new processes for AI, then the question becomes, how do I support that from an infrastructure standpoint? And then,
Yeah.
so it is very possible that AI, what we're seeing is that AI is actually bringing these groups together. It's actually forcing some of them to start to collaborate in ways that they never had to before. So I think that's a fast and upcoming trend because I mean, I do need to make sure I get the user experience and performance I expect out of my AI tools, but I also need to make sure that they're secured. And so everyone needs to be in the room at the same time to figure out how that occurs.
Yeah, again, it makes perfect sense to me. I'll throw another one out there too. The folks that are, yeah, you can call it GRC, but the ones that are specifically around data and data governance, I think are
Mm.
starting to have more of a role too. Amit, what are you seeing?
Yeah, I mean, data governance is one. The other one we see a lot of is compliance
Yep.
and segmentation, right? So there's a lot of initiatives right now. We're seeing this across the board where segmentation is being mandated, just given the threat landscape and given everything that's going on. So we're seeing it across like university systems.
Are you
Of course,
seeing
we're
that?
seeing it.
And I don't mean to interrupt you, but are you seeing that from? And I have this whole conversation that we could have otherwise, but we'll touch on it real quickly because you brought it up. Are you seeing that division also come from vendor and supply side controls? I mean, we've talked forever about the regulatory controls and the necessity of taking and maintaining your regulatory compliance and so on and so forth. I've seen that shift really go from the regulatory set of standards to a vendor and supply chain set of standards. And the reason that you're seeing that, again, talking about AI, the velocity of change that comes with the churn that AI brings actually requires a set of controls that are usually not government created, because the government created controls, and I say this, I love you all in the NIST and CMMC world, it takes too long. And I say that as a person who has actively worked on those controls. I mean, from time to start to time to end, we spend 3 weeks taking and talking about whether we should cross that T this way or that way, right? So, I mean, literally, it takes too long. Well, in that time, AI has evolved 37 times, and you cannot possibly keep up. I don't mean to interrupt you, but I wanted to see if that was something that you're seeing as well.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, look, supply chain security is a point of concern, but like you mentioned, right? AI is evolving so fast. I don't think controls are going to be able to evolve as quickly necessarily, right? So we need to think of more sort of proactive ways and preventive ways of dealing with that. But one of those ways is segmentation, right? In segment and
Yeah.
zero trust segmentation, and we're seeing mandates come across the board. I was like mentioning, like there's a large university system in the U.S. that's requiring all the campuses to be fully segmented by a certain date, failing which then they start to lose funding and lose budgets, right? And these organizations are realizing that you just can't do this with a legacy infrastructure, right? You just can't keep dropping firewalls over the place, creating network-based segments. You need to think zero trust. You need to think differently. And SASE is often the architecture that they converge upon, right? So we're seeing that in the federal government. We're seeing that for protecting critical infrastructure for OT systems. We're seeing that across the board. And then the security and network infra teams are the ones that are supposed to deliver on this in a cost-effective way under budget constraints within timelines, right?
Yeah, no, I agree with you. Kieran, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, I think what we've found is that a SASE project is often bringing entirely new groups of people into the same room for the first time. And my background is in networking, and the networking world was very clearly understood in the past. You had the different seniority levels, but it was all very much within that network boundary. And you start to look at a SASE project now, and now we've got to take into account things like the identity management teams, the teams that are responsible for workplace devices and endpoints and so on, because we're putting client endpoints out there. So that whole concept now that you've got a solution that is user identity aware is kind of prompting enterprises to think, well, how can we lock down these environments more effectively than we would have previously? So not just have the network be completely open, and segmentation is part of that, putting certain user groups in certain segments and so on. So it's a far broader conversation than either a network only or a security only conversation would have been in the past, because there's a lot more functionality that can be enabled. And I think there's a need there to manage those transitions very effectively. Otherwise, it becomes a little bit of a free for all. Everybody wants their little piece of it and implementing their functionality. It requires kind of the voice of reason in the room to be able to guide the enterprise through that process and to come out of it with something that keeps the stakeholders happy, but is also objectively taking the business forward as well.
Yep. No, I couldn't agree with you guys more. And I want to talk more, and I want people to be talking more about, the idea of having, the segmented network, understanding what some of those drivers are going to be, the number of organizations that are going to require this level of segmentation and control in their network environments. If you are taking and touching their environment or using data from their environment, that number is not going down. That number will continue to increase. So if you are looking at trying to address many of these particular issues, looking at a SASE solution makes a lot of sense to do those things. Kind of the next question that I want to ask is, when you talk about SD-WAN and native integration, how critical is it to have native integration with edge computing as part of a SASE strategy? SD-WAN native integration with edge computing as part of a SASE strategy. Kieran, why don't we start with you? The data I thought was actually pretty interesting when it's all said and done. Universally, it was agreed that it was either somewhat or very important. So that was 100%. There was no question about it. Talk to me about what your experience is in that regard.
Yeah, we see this vary quite a bit between industry verticals. So we do a lot of work with global manufacturers, and the whole modernization of the OT environment and leveraging cloud services and cloud functionality in that OT environment is driving a lot of the use cases we're seeing for edge compute. So we're seeing now far more of an interest in, well, what could be deployed directly at the production facility to be able to process data, to be able to
Yep.
do computer vision models and other specialist functionality that just wasn't feasible before because the application layer wasn't there. But now that that's becoming more easily accessible, there's a need for compute that's sitting in a very distributed way at the edge to be able to run that. So I think that's becoming a really significant use case in those certain verticals where there's obvious use cases for it. Equally, we work with enterprises in verticals where there's just not a clear use case. Insurance companies, for example, we still see a lot of businesses that are actively trying to reduce their footprint at the edge as opposed to build out additional functionality. So I think where it is becoming widely deployed, and taking those manufacturers as a perfect example, there's a strong interest there in consistent security policies. They don't want every one of these sites to be configured separately, to have their own local nuance of it. They want it to be part of a holistic global design and architecture so that everything becomes a bit easier. Compliance, reporting, and so on becomes much easier because it's all running off that core set of policies. So I think that's the interconnect we see between the two, that definite use cases for edge compute, but when it is being done, they want it to make sense in the overall SASE architecture as well.
Yeah, makes perfect sense. Kevin, do you have anything to add?
Well, I think we're seeing what Karen is seeing as well. Perhaps I'll just add a few additional use cases because we see scenarios where traditional compute that might be set up as separate applications or workloads are now converging into that edge location, and you converge SD-WAN along with those applications. So simple examples like fast food restaurants or any of these kind of retail locations where you already have applications or workloads running in these locations, you just converge them together along with your WAN edge device. So pre-existing application, but now you can see better convergence. The second is actually just new use cases. So we talked a lot about AI. The ability now, we're increasingly seeing these use cases where inference can be pushed closer and closer to the edge. And I think some of these scenarios are things that probably are dependent on performance. And so take examples like, when you go grocery shopping now, you can self-checkout. And most of those have a camera checking to see whether there's fraudulent activity. Now, most of that is driven by some sort of AI inference model sitting as close as possible to that checkout area. You want to keep that as close to the user and as close to that kiosk for performance reasons. But also you see things like you can get on the airplanes now using facial recognition. All these things, performance-related requirements that are driven by AI, but also the use case themselves.
Cool.
And by the way, oh, sorry, Chris.
Oh, go ahead, Kevin.
No, I was going to say, it'll be really interesting to have this conversation again in 6 months, because I think these use cases are coming up very quickly and somewhat unexpectedly, and you can't even forecast what might be happening.
You can't. No, it's literally my job to do that. And people ask me all the time. And I'm like, I have absolutely no flipping clue. I mean, things are changing so often. Well, let's take your example, for example, that you used. You go to the supermarket now, and you don't even have to punch in that you're buying a russet potato. It knows. And it's kind of freakish, because the other day I had a weird banana and it decided it was a banana. And so it obviously made a mistake. But at the same time, the idea that it is hitting 95% correct, that it's looking at a potato to put into my grocery sack, that is something that literally did not exist at the beginning of this year. We're here at the end of April, and that is something that didn't exist January 1st. So that is how fast, not only is it innovating, but being adopted and accepted as part of the use case and the real world production environment that we have going on. Amit, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, no, I agree with everything you and Kevin said, right? I think there's always going to be use cases for edge computing, right? To all of the waves of innovation we've seen in networking and security, there's one fundamental limit that we eventually run up against, which is the speed of light.
Yeah.
And sitting here in North America, like, we have the luxury of being sort of like really well meshed with networks and data centers. But as you go out to the rest of the world, right, I've talked to customers in Eastern Europe and then other parts of Asia where they're taking longer paths and things that, work really well for us here just don't work as well over there, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and I think moving some of the compute, moving some of the inference, as Kevin mentioned, closer to the edge is sort of oftentimes the only viable option to improve performance and responsiveness for some of these use cases, right? So I think look, in the world of SASE, this things is gonna always have to do at the edge, right? The number here that pops up is predictive analytics for bandwidth and latency, right? What better place to measure that than from the edge,
Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
those are the use cases
Absolutely
that
correct.
will always be edge bound. And I think it's important to have a SaaS. I mean, we think about SASE as primarily cloud delivered, but there is a strong edge component to it as well.
Cool. We got two questions left. We have about 10 minutes to go. I wanted to take and burn through these real quickly. Talk to me about the significant hurdles from transitioning from a standalone SD-WAN to a unified solution. Emmett, we'll start with you.
Yeah, so just looking at some of these data points, right? So like I think somewhat difficult stands as a top topic. So look, as organizations are moving to SASE, we talked about sort of the single vendor versus dual vendor options, right? A lot of organizations are dealing with integration between what do I do with all of my legacy infrastructure, right? I can't throw it out on day one. I have to make that work together for a period of time. And that's where some of the integration difficulties and challenges come from. And that's where I think, Garen, folks like your organization kind of really steps in and helps customers navigate some of this. But there's some other concerns that are popping up here, like proxy availability and performance, which it's a legitimate concern about, hey, what happens if the service goes out, right? How do I ensure it's resilient? How do I ensure I have a backup plan?
And I agree with all that, but let me throw this out there too. And when I first saw this data, one of the things that I thought was really interesting is that I think that you have to take and look at the maturity of the organization answering the question in order to really fundamentally get where they're coming from. So again, let's go back to the greenfield conversation that we were having. If you're greenfield and you are a major tech company and you're doing something from scratch, this is actually a slam dunk, especially compared to a multi a multi-skewed environment with multiple tools and multiple solutions all over the place. Having a standalone SASE solution is very comparatively easy. If you're trying to integrate and you're a small to mid-tier business and you're trying to integrate with a gazillion different other solutions, it is complex. It is very difficult to make all those things work. So keep that in mind when you're looking at this data. It does depend on the maturity. It does depend on the environment that you're taking and going into. Kieran, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, I think looking at the list here, this is a list of the problems that we solve every day for clients
Yeah,
because
of course it is,
every one
right?
of these things happens on a regular basis. And I think what's interesting is it's not a one-time thing. It's not you make the transition and then everything is good. There's We're running networks today on the internet for global enterprises. There are going to be anomalies that crop up, a peering issue or unexplained packet loss between different hops on the internet that result in not great performance back to one of the breakout points to the internet and so on. So I think it speaks to the need for the right level of expertise across the whole end-to-end solution. So using a modern approach, using API integrations into the SSE or SASE providers to get things like POP availability and performance and getting heads up about maintenance so we know in advance when a piece of infrastructure is going to be out of commission so we can steer our clients away from that. So you can't, even as a managed service provider, adopt a legacy mindset and expect to get a good performance or user experience outcome
Yep.
in this type of complex world. You have to be able to use all of those tools very effectively to stay ahead of these types of problems. So yeah,
Totally agree with you.
it never ends. It's what we really do
Totally
see
agree.
there.
Kevin, did you have anything to add?
Actually, Kieran took my thoughts. So, but maybe I'll just double down on his point on expertise and process, right? Like to the point before about having legacy just experience in place, whether it's technology, whether it's the process, whether it's the people that are operating it. I think what is likely going to take some time is this challenge of how do you bring it together, and that requires more than just the technology, but it requires the folks that know how to both migrate, but then operate it on a day-to-day basis.
That's right.
So I'll double down on Kieran's point.
No, I totally agree with you. I think again, a lot of times we forget about not only the implementation in phoning a friend to help with implementation, but then you have the long-standing maintenance and administration of that particular environment. And I think sometimes we forget about it. I don't know why we do, but it seems to me that we do. So, last question. I think we all have a kind of a different opinion on this. It'll be really interesting to see what you guys believe. The number one result, I think, is actually even bigger than that. But which SD-WAN SASE innovation do you think will have the biggest business impact over the next several years? I don't know how you can't really be thinking that it's AI just because AI is seemingly dominating everything. But in the grand scheme of things, what else are you seeing? So, Kieran, we'll start with you, and then we'll kind of move around.
Yeah, I think it's making sense of the just vast mountain of data that all of these
Yep.
platforms generate. The platforms predated this sort of AI wave by a couple of years, and we saw a lot of disillusionment with early adopters of SASE, and even before that SD-WAN. They're saying there's hundreds of thousands or millions of data points here, making sense out of that and finding the right conclusions and turning that into actionable business outcomes was next to impossible with traditional techniques. And that's one specific thing that we've seen AI solve very effectively, to be able to find that pattern in the data, to find the relevant trend that wasn't immediately obvious using traditional techniques, and be able to recommend policies that could help mitigate that, or make the right type of executive dashboard to be able to show a trend in a way that wasn't easily visible before. So being able to, for the different personas in the enterprise, use that technology most effectively to find those needles in an increasingly big haystack is probably the single biggest thing that we're seeing promise in. And it's already better now than it was 6 months ago and a year ago. The pace that this is moving at is just beyond comprehension for many enterprises. So I think there's going to be a huge difference here in the outcomes that enterprises achieve based on either what they're doing internally to take advantage of the pace of that development, or the partners and specialists that they work with, because what works well now is definitely not something that was anywhere near possible even a handful of months ago. So I think that's
Totally
going to
agree.
catch a lot of people by surprise.
Yep. Kevin, any thoughts?
I would say how we interact with technology is going to change. So if we think about things like a Claude-like experience or a Gen AI-like experience to interact with, actually Kieran talked about data, but also just the underlying controls, like the way that we set policies can be set up using human-like language, or the way that we process the information. Part of it will be that you have to process so much information, but also you can actually interact with the data pools that you're looking for in human language. And so suddenly some of the complexity of how you manage and deploy and set things up will start to shift and make life a little bit easier. And maybe, Chris, I'll just add a sub bullet as well. I would also say, some of the things that we've talked about for some time will also become more pronounced as well. So you called out zero trust at the very beginning of this discussion. So I think, yes, there's going to be innovations that change how we work and how we secure and how we provide infrastructure. I think part of what will also become more pronounced is how do we bring things like zero trust, or how will zero trust become more pronounced? Like Amit talked about some of the things.
Yeah.
But I think that will persist, but actually become more pronounced.
Yep. I totally agree with that. I have 17 hours to talk about that, and I'm not going to do it now. I might go ahead and wrap this one up.
Yeah. So I mean, look, one of the fundamental theses behind SASE is a simplification, an operational simplification, right? So some of the top two items here don't surprise me. What does surprise me is that user experience didn't climb up to the top three, right? It had a strong showing in one of the earlier responses.
Yep.
But what this tells us is like where the pain lies right now, right? These areas, automation, observability are the areas where the market's expecting more innovations and more efficiencies to come by unifying everything onto one platform. So,
I agree.
good
I'll,
takeaway.
I'll give you my 10-second spiel. If there is ever a time where these kind of innovations are a force multiplier, and I say that and I preface it by saying I hate those words with a passion, okay? But if there's ever a time where it's true, it is in the current environment that we are in. And looking at these new emerging technologies and how they truly radically change how we view technology and technology architecture is very compelling to me, and those are things that I'm very excited about over the next few years. Um, I wanted to quickly hit on this. I know that we're basically out of time. What does this mean to your organization? Please go and read the report. I'm not going to sit here and read all these to you. It is absolutely worth reading the report. There is a ton of different nuggets. We only covered the broadest aspect of all of these. It is very much worth taking and reading the report, contacting these organizations, seeing what they might have to add to your overall conversation when it comes to SASE, when it comes to technological innovation. A friend before, it is absolutely impossible to do these things by yourself at this point. The things are changing, so the technology rapidly because of AI, because of everything else, that everybody should be phoning a friend. You don't have to be the expert on everything. I have 3 experts here that will help you, and I'm not one of them. I will phone a friend as well. So make certain that you're talking with those folks. Here's a little bit of information. I'll leave this slide up for a minute. Raleigh's going to pop back on here in a moment. Here is where you can find information from each of these organizations, Coevolve, Versa, and Zscaler. Please check out their websites. Please check out these links. And gentlemen, I so appreciate you coming on to this webinar today. Absolutely worth our time. Definitely not boring slideware as usual. I think that you gave great insights into what's actually going on, not only with organizations today, but what's going to happen in the future. So again, thank you very much.
Thanks for having us, Chris.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Raleigh, I pass it back on to you.
Thanks, Chris. Yes, I wanted to thank our expert panel for all their great insights. As Chris mentioned, please check out these additional resources and check out the follow-up email that will include the on-demand playback, as well as links to these resources and even more information. So check that email out. Thank you for joining us today, and we hope to see you at a future EMA research webinar.
Gentlemen, thank you.